The eviction notice had her name on it, signed by her daughter-in-law, delivered by her own son. Family photos lay smashed on the lawn, on the house she still legally owned. Upstairs, Kayla filmed a moving in reel, smiling like she hadn't stolen a life. Lori didn't shout, didn't beg. She picked up the deed. "They want a house," she whispered. "I'll show them what it costs to take one." "All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The room still smelled faintly of bergamot and floor polish. Sunlight poured through the windows, warm and cheerful in all the wrong ways. Margaret Evans sat perfectly upright in a high-backed chair at the long walnut conference table, her hands folded neatly over her purse. The leather was cracked and worn, soft from years of use, like the woman holding it. Across from her, her only son, Darren, leaned forward with all the tact of a buzzard circling fresh grief. "So what do I get?" he asked, his tone casual but sharp, like a blade dulled by habit. The attorney, a graying man named Hollis, flinched just slightly. "Mr. Evans, we haven't read the will yet." Darren shrugged and offered a lopsided grin. "Come on, it's not like Dad left surprises. House, car, retirement, just need to know how soon I can start managing it." Margaret didn't look at him. She stared instead at a tiny scratch in the polished table, the silence stretching long enough to become a statement of its own. The scratch reminded her of Charles, her husband of 42 years. He would have hated this, not just Darren's bluntness, but the assumption behind it, that inheritance was owed, that family was transactional, that death was just a delayed payout. Hollis cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" But Margaret raised a hand, calm, steady, intentional. She reached into her handbag, not for a tissue, not for a memento, but for something folded, crisp, and carefully creased. A single sheet of paper. She placed it in front of Darren like a legal document. "What's this?" he asked. "Your inheritance," she said softly. Darren scoffed. "Cute." His fingers unfolded it with smug anticipation. The smirk held for 3 seconds, then faltered. His eyes moved down the page, scanning line after line. Item 1. Neonatal hospital bills, $12,850, paid in full. Item 8. Weekly groceries for 18 years, average $95 per week, total $89,640. Item 14. Emergency credit card debt from Vegas, $10,000. Item 21. Therapist sessions after you dropped out, $4,500. Item 29. Bail bond, $7,200. No questions asked. Darren's mouth twitched. "You kept records?" Margaret's voice didn't rise. "You kept receipts when you gave your ex that engagement ring. I kept mine for 28 years of motherhood." He tossed the page onto the table. "This is emotional blackmail." "No," she said evenly. "This is a balance sheet." The room chilled, though the sunlight still poured in. Hollis opened the official envelope and began reading aloud. "To my wife, Margaret Ann Evans, I leave all assets, the home, the vehicles, our joint retirement, and savings. I do so with full knowledge and without coercion. To my son, Darren." Darren leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Nothing further is allocated, as previous financial assistance has been ample and documented." Darren slammed his hand on the table. "He wouldn't do that. You twisted him. You turned him against me." Margaret blinked slowly. "No, Darren. You did that all on your own." Flashbacks rolled through her like an old reel. Darren, age 15, lying about gas money and stealing cash from her purse. 23, calling collect from jail after a bar fight. Charles paid the bond, no thanks given. 31, crying on their couch about a startup failing while skimming rent from 3 roommates. Charles had quietly emptied a bond account to help him. The thanks? Darren disappeared for a year. Margaret had begged Charles not to cut him off. "He's still our son." But Charles had only shaken his head. "No, he's someone we raised. Who he became, that's on him." The room had fallen silent, but the tension crackled like static on an old radio. Darren's fingers clenched the paper, now creased and damp at the corners. His eyes darted over each line, no longer reading, just staring, as if hoping the numbers might change. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't have to. The list did the talking. Her voice echoed in her own mind, layering memory over math. Item 2. Diapers for 2 years. Bulk purchased, coupon cut, bargain stretched. $1,760. The memory floated in. Her hunched over a laundry basket, Darren screaming in the crib. Charles was working nights back then. She'd sing softly, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Mama's here, baby boy, Mama's here. Item 7. After-school tutoring. $6,300 over 4 years. She'd taken a part-time job shelving books at the library to afford it. Darren had trouble with fractions. Not attention. He had plenty of that when he wanted, but the details, the follow-through, always had. Now, Darren slammed the receipt onto the polished table. This is insane. You can't charge someone for being their mother. Margaret finally met his eyes, calm, precise. You asked what you were owed. I answered. Hollis, the attorney, cleared his throat like a man stepping into traffic. Shall I continue with the will? Darren didn't respond. He was too busy trying to regain the smirk he'd walked in with. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and resumed reading. Per the last legally filed will of Charles Henry Evans, dated 14 months prior to his passing, all assets are designated to his surviving spouse, Margaret Evans. This includes the primary residence, all investment accounts, vehicles, and life insurance policies. Darren blinked. That's not right. There are no secondary beneficiaries listed, Hollis added, voice soft but unshakable. That's not, no. Darren shoved away from the table. His chair screeched across the floor. He said he'd take care of me. He promised. I'm his son. You were, Margaret murmured, when it counted. The words landed like a slap, but Margaret's voice was no louder than a breath. Darren turned to her. You knew. You planned this. I honored his wishes. This is emotional blackmail, Darren snapped. You bring a receipt to a will reading? Are you trying to humiliate me? No, she said. I'm trying to remind you. Another memory crept into her throat like smoke. Item 11. Therapy copays after your DUI. $3,800. He'd cried in the kitchen after his arrest. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Mom. She had hugged him so tightly, her shoulder bruised from where he'd slammed the car door a night before. I gave you everything, Margaret whispered now, to no one in particular. And you walked through it like a fog. You let him do this. Darren turned toward Hollis. My own father, he turned his back on me. No, Hollis said gently. Your father made a decision. Darren's hands trembled. I'll contest it. This isn't over. You're welcome to try, Margaret said, standing and collecting her purse. I'm sure the court would enjoy seeing your bank records, the ones we had to clean up. He stared at her, breathing hard, but she didn't wait. She turned toward the door, the sound of her shoes crisp against the hardwood, measured like a ticking clock winding down. As she reached the elevator, the silence behind her finally broke. I'll fight this in court, Darren shouted. Margaret paused, her back to him. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the elevator's mirrored surface. She didn't turn around. You do that, she said, almost kindly, but bring a better receipt. The elevator doors closed slowly around her, swallowing the tension. But Darren's voice still rang in her ears, sharp, desperate, already planning his counterattack. Margaret's hand curled around her purse as she whispered to herself, You asked what you were owed. Now you'll learn what you cost. The front door clicked shut behind Margaret with the heavy finality of a prison cell. The air inside the house felt thinner than it had that morning, emptier. No lawyer, no son, no husband, just the scent of furniture polish and the faint hum of a refrigerator that sounded too loud in a home so quiet. Margaret placed her purse on the hall table, the folded receipt still inside like a live wire. Her fingers hovered over it before retreating. Not yet, not here. She walked into the living room. The late afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains Charles used to grumble about, said they made the house look like a funeral parlor. She had left them up anyway. Maybe he'd been right. Her eyes drifted toward the recliner he died in. His blanket was still folded over the backrest. She hadn't been able to move it, but now she folded it again, tighter this time, and placed it in a storage chest without a word. She wasn't crying. Grief had cried its tears in the hospice wing, in the car, at the pharmacy counter when she forgot which pills were his and which were hers. Now it had calcified, hardened into resolve. In the kitchen, she sat down with a cup of black coffee and stared at the calendar. 1 week since the funeral. 1 day since Darren had tried to rip her future from her hands, and years since she'd started losing both of them, one to illness, the other to greed. Charles had changed near the end, more watchful, more deliberate. Margaret used to catch him staring at Darren during his visits, not with warmth, but with suspicion. The final few months, their conversations were clipped. Darren started showing up less, and when he did, it was all numbers. One evening, Charles had whispered to her in bed, voice hoarse but eyes sharp. "He's not coming for us. He's coming for what we built." At the time, she'd argued, pleaded even. "He's our son," she'd said. "We have to give him something." Charles shook his head. "Giving him more is like feeding an open wound." That night, Margaret opens the drawer in their old roll-top desk. It sticks, always had. She pulls harder, and it creaks open like an exhale. There, under old bank statements and a dried-out pen, is a cream envelope, sealed with Charles's wax stamp. His initials melted in red. She opens it slowly. His handwriting is shaky, but still familiar. Strong. Controlled. "M, if you're reading this, it means I wasn't strong enough to say it aloud. You tried to save him, I know. But Darren, he made his choice a long time ago. When he looked me in the eye and said, 'I'm not interested in your legacy. I want liquidity,' I knew he wasn't my son anymore. He was just a liability." Margaret's fingers tremble, not from weakness but fury. "He's already stolen from us in spirit and in silence, but he doesn't get to steal the rest. Protect what's left. You know what needs to be done. Take back what he stole from you." She folds the letter twice, then again, tighter than before, and slips it into the lockbox beneath her bed. In the hallway, the family photo of the three of them stares down from the wall. She walks over, lifts it off the hook. Behind it, taped to the drywall, is a small key, Charles's safe key. She hadn't known he'd hidden it there. In the bedroom closet, she unlocks the floor safe and starts pulling documents. Old property deeds, insurance policies, safety deposit information. She starts organizing them by type and value. Her movements are sharp, efficient, surgical. Her hand lingers only once on a faded envelope labeled 1994, Darren's college fund. Empty. Margaret tucks it back in. No need to keep it now. In the dead hush of evening, she walks room by room, locking drawers, sealing files, snapping small padlocks around anything that once held a title, a claim, a cost. Her steps echo against hardwood floors stripped of rugs, each click like punctuation. He was born under a full moon, with 10 fingers, 10 toes, and eyes that wrapped Margaret in instant hope. "He's going to change the world," Charles had whispered, proud tears streaking his face. But 29 years later, the only thing Darren changed was how deeply Margaret could ache. She stood at her kitchen sink, staring out the window, watching a squirrel dart across the yard. Her fingers trembled slightly as they gripped her coffee mug, steam rising between her knuckles. That morning's mail sat unopened, except one envelope with Darren's name stamped in legal font, a notice of claim. She set the mug down harder than intended. The ceramic clink echoed through the empty house. Margaret found herself driving, barely remembering the turns until her sister's house came into view. Lorraine opened the door in slippers, her graying hair twisted up in a clip, brows already raised. "You look like hell," Lorraine said, pulling her inside. "I feel worse." They sat across from each other in the living room, sunlight catching on the dust in the air. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope, setting it on the coffee table like a wound she couldn't hide. Lorraine read it in silence, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He's suing me," Margaret said flatly. "For what? Raising him?" Lorraine snapped. You gave that boy more grace than any mother I've ever seen." Margaret's hands folded in her lap, then unfolded. "Do you remember when he borrowed 10,000 from you?" Lorraine gave a sharp laugh. "Which time? Before or after he swore he needed it for that landscaping business that never existed?" Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You didn't just give him chances, Mags," Lorraine said, leaning in. "You gave him lifeboats, and he torched everyone." Margaret sighed. "Charles once said, 'Love doesn't always fix what it finds broken.' Charles paid off $75,000 in gambling debt just to keep Darren from being arrested." Margaret nodded. The memory was a bitter pit in her stomach. Charles had mortgaged part of his retirement to cover the debt, hoping it would be Darren's wake-up call. It wasn't. The next year, he crashed another startup, leaving investors, including family friends, furious and unpaid. "He charmed everyone, even us," Margaret said. "We thought it was just immaturity, but it wasn't." Lorraine's voice was colder now. "You were protecting a fantasy version of him. You weren't alone, but you were wrong." The silence that followed was heavy. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall cut through it. "I'm scared," Margaret finally said. "Not of the lawsuit, of what he's capable of if he doesn't get what he wants." Lorraine didn't flinch. "He's not your son anymore. He's an opportunist, and opportunists always escalate." Margaret stared down at her hands, the same hands that had once swaddled Darren in soft blankets, the same hands that now trembled signing defense documents. A soft knock interrupted them. Lorraine opened the front door, returning with another envelope. This one was from Darren's attorney. Official court notice. The legal demand. Darren was challenging the will and requesting a third of the estate based on parental entitlement. Margaret didn't speak as she read it. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Line after line of betrayal dressed in legalese. Her son, her only child, was coming for the life she and Charles had built. Lorraine broke the silence. "You have to fight him, Margaret, with everything you've got." Margaret's voice was steel now. "Then I'll start by fighting fair and finishing cruel." Margaret folded the notice slowly and whispered, "He wants a piece of the estate? He has no idea what I'm about to give him." Margaret had never set foot in a courtroom before Charles's death. She had imagined them sterile, hushed places of reason. But on that first morning, as she stepped through the courthouse doors with the weight of a lawsuit in her handbag, she understood. Court wasn't a place for peace. It was a coliseum, and she wasn't here to grieve anymore. She was here to fight. Sadie Larson was nothing like the lawyers Darren had seen in his television dramas. No gray wool suit, no cigars, no pomp, just sharp eyes, clean black slacks, a leather laptop bag, and a voice that cut through bullshit like glass. "Let me be clear," she told Margaret during their first meeting over iced tea and manila folders. "You hired me to win, not to comfort. If he wants war, we file like we're loading ammo." Margaret had nodded, sliding the folder across the table. Inside, Charles's medical reports, copies of Darren's threatening texts, and most damning of all, a psychiatric evaluation Charles had privately requested the year before his death. It detailed Darren's history of manipulation, emotional volatility, and a disturbing lack of empathy. "I begged Charles to put Darren in the will," Margaret admitted softly, "but he said he'd rather fund a stranger's future than a parasite's." Sadie didn't blink. "Then let's make sure the parasite doesn't eat what's left." Court proceedings began with Darren's team presenting their case, a claim of undue influence and emotional duress. He painted himself as the dutiful son, left in the cold by a controlling mother and a mentally unwell father. In one document, he accused Margaret of coercing Charles into rewriting the will while in a deteriorated state. But Margaret brought more than just her grief to the witness stand. She brought receipts, literal and metaphorical, every gift, every loan, every debt paid off, each one attached to a bank transfer, a signature, a timeline. She didn't raise her voice, didn't weep. She simply testified like someone who'd been paying attention for decades. "Did you ever coerce your husband into changing his will?" the opposing counsel asked, leaning forward with artificial concern. Margaret looked the jury in the eye. "I spent 38 years building a life with him. If you think I needed to coerce him into protecting it, then you didn't know Charles." The courtroom buzzed. Darren squirmed behind his lawyer. Then came Sadie's moment. "Your Honor," she said, standing slowly. "The plaintiff submitted this digital document as supporting evidence of his father's intent. We had the metadata verified. On the screen, a will appeared, bearing Charles's signature, and a date that predated his death by just 1 month. In it, Darren was listed as the sole heir." Darren smirked, eyes flicking toward Margaret. Sadie walked closer to the monitor. "That signature was time-stamped 2 days after Charles had surgery, during which he was sedated and unconscious for over 36 hours. The hospital has the logs." A stunned silence filled the room. Darren's attorney paled. Sadie didn't flinch. "It's a forgery." The judge leaned back. "Motion to strike the document from consideration is granted. But this case isn't over." Margaret didn't flinch either, but she did turn her eyes, just once, to Darren. His face had drained of color. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air had turned sharp. Leaves blew across the steps as Margaret adjusted her coat. She thought she might feel relief, but all she felt was cold. Darren was already waiting by the sidewalk, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw her, he stepped forward, voice low and laced with fury. "You'll regret doing this alone," he said. Margaret stopped, met his eyes. "I've never been more accompanied in my life." The attic stairs creaked like a confession as Margaret pulled the string and watched the narrow ladder descend into the dim hallway. It was nearly midnight, the kind of hour when the walls of an old house whispered secrets, and Margaret, flashlight in hand, wasn't sure she wanted to hear them. She climbed slowly, knees stiff, joints burning. She hadn't been up there in years. Charles had always handled the boxes, the Christmas lights, the taxes tucked in fireproof folders. But he was gone now, and Darren, God help her, Darren had stirred something in her grief that was no longer sadness. It was vigilance. The attic smelled like mothballs and aged paper. Dust bloomed in the beam of her flashlight. She shuffled past an old baby crib, a cracked snow globe, and a chest marked Home Insurance, 2005 to 2011. None of it mattered anymore. She needed something older, something raw. Near the back wall, beneath a faded quilt, she found it. A weathered leather journal with Charles's initials burned into the corner. There were others, 5 in total, stacked neatly in a shoebox marked Old Receipts. Her fingers trembled as she opened the first one. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charles's pen had always pressed hard, as if he needed the page to feel the weight of what he couldn't say aloud. May 3rd, 2002. Darren smashed the cabinet door again, said it was just stress. I looked into his eyes and didn't recognize my son. October 15th, 2007. Paid $3,000 to keep Darren's name off that incident report. Margaret doesn't know. I told her the garage door repair cost more than expected. December 22nd, 2014. He grabbed my wrist during the argument. Harder than he meant to? Or exactly how hard he meant to? I didn't sleep that night. Margaret sat down on the attic floor, air thick and still. Every word was a weight, each entry proof of something Charles had never spoken. Not to her, not to anyone. In one entry dated just 6 months before his death, Charles had written, "If anything happens to me before we can finish the estate papers, know this. He is not entitled to our life. He lost his way. Don't let him take you down with him." Margaret closed the journal and exhaled slowly. It wasn't just grief pressing on her chest. It was a warning. Charles had seen the danger in their son but tried to handle it alone. Now she had to carry what he couldn't finish. Downstairs, the house was silent. Too silent. She descended the attic stairs with the journals tucked under her arm and set them beside the folder Sadie had left her. Documents, witness notes, strategy. The journals added texture to the legal skeleton. Emotion backed by evidence. By morning, Margaret was locking every drawer in the study. She removed Charles's last checkbook from the safe behind the armoire and photographed every remaining page. She double-checked the deed filing on her laptop, then copied files to a flash drive that she slipped into her robe pocket. Her home had become less sanctuary, more command post. The wallpaper in the kitchen seemed to peel faster. The light in the foyer flickered like it too, was tired of pretending everything was normal. Margaret sat at the edge of the dining table and stared at the empty chair across from her. Charles's chair. She thought she might cry, but no tears came. Instead, her breath steadied, her spine straightened. She reached for the journal again and began marking entries with colored tabs. Darren had erased his history with charm and entitlement, but Charles had kept the receipts. By nightfall, she'd compiled a new document for Sadie, timeline of abusive events, copies of relevant journal pages, a summary letter in her own hand. She lit a single candle in the living room and left the rest of the lights off. As shadows stretched across the walls, she realized something chilling. Darren hadn't just broken her heart. He'd broken into it, slowly, over years, and he wasn't finished. At 2:13 a.m., a sound snapped through the stillness, a sharp clunk, followed by the soft squeal of rusted hinges. Margaret froze. It came from the garage. She reached for the fireplace poker and stepped toward the back door, unaware that the side window in the garage was cracked open and someone was already inside. The garage door was open by 3 inches when Margaret stepped outside, barefoot and breathless, gripping a fireplace poker like it could somehow hold back every fear that crept beneath her ribs. She flipped the switch by the door. Nothing. The garage light had been unscrewed. Silence. Then, a shuffle in the far corner. She froze. The shadows didn't move, but something in the air had changed. Heavier. Denser. She stepped closer. The poker trembled slightly in her hand as her eyes adjusted. The tools on the pegboard were undisturbed. Her husband's old workbench still bore the tiny burn mark from when Darren had scorched it in high school trying to solder a stolen iPod charger. She crouched near the side window, just enough to see the glass pushed inward. A single boot print marked the dusty floor. One print. No second. Like a ghost had stepped in, looked around, and vanished. She locked the garage manually, sliding the bolt with shaking hands, and called 911. 2 officers came just after 4 a.m., one young, one older, both tired-eyed but courteous. "No signs of forced entry," the older one said, squinting at the boot print. "But definitely not yours, ma'am." Margaret nodded. "No one was supposed to be out here. My husband kept this locked every night." The younger cop crouched near the footprint taking a photo. "Nothing's missing. Nothing broken? Number just that." She pointed at the footprint. "That and the feeling that someone wanted me to know they were here." They exchanged a look. Fingerprint dusting yielded nothing. Whoever it was had worn gloves or knew exactly how to leave fear and nothing else. By 9 a.m., Margaret sat at her kitchen table with Sadie on speakerphone. "This was intimidation," Sadie said flatly. "Have someone install motion-activated lights and indoor cameras. You can write them off as part of case security." "I can't prove it was Darren," Margaret whispered. "You don't have to. Let him keep showing his colors. Eventually, he'll paint himself into a corner." Margaret's gaze flicked to the attic stairs, where the journals now sat locked in a fireproof case. "I think that corner's getting closer." The next morning, her neighbor Carol lingered by the mailbox longer than usual. "Morning," Carol said. "I heard you had a situation the other night?" Margaret managed a smile. "Just a false alarm." Carol tilted her head. "Well, Darren was such a sweet boy growing up. Maybe you two just need to talk things out." It stung. More than Margaret wanted to admit. She hadn't even told Carol about the break-in. News travels fast when people want something to whisper about. By Friday, Margaret's phone buzzed with a notification. Darren Truth posted a new video. "My mother turned on me after my father died." She hesitated, then tapped. The video opened with Darren sitting on a couch, eyes red, lips quivering. "I loved my dad, and I love my mom, but ever since he passed, she's changed. She's accusing me of awful things, trying to erase me from the will. I think she's not well." Margaret's hands clenched the edge of the counter. The background of the video was blurred, but familiar. The guest room at his friend Levi's place, no doubt. "I just want peace," Darren sniffled. "But she's making this public. She's destroying our family's memory." Comments flooded in within hours. F family. First 98. She sounds like a narcissist. Has hope for sons. Cutting a son out after a funeral? Cold, Levi strong. Darren stayed with me, he's not lying. Margaret's inbox filled with cruel messages. One called her a spiteful widow. Another asked if she'd ever heard of elder abuse in reverse. The irony made her nauseous. Sadie texted, "Don't respond. Let facts speak, not feelings." That night, a plain white envelope sat on the welcome mat. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single typed note on printer paper, "Drop the case," or "We drop something heavier, drop." Margaret read it twice. The words didn't shake, but her hands did. The video had barely been up 24 hours when Margaret's phone began buzzing like a trapped bee. A notification here, a ping there, each one carving into her peace. At first, she ignored them, until a subject line popped up from her neighbor's daughter. Is this about you?" She clicked the link. There he was. Darren. His face lit with soft lighting and filtered tears, seated on a couch with a well-placed photo of Charles behind him. "I never wanted to go public," he began, his voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "But my mom left me no choice." Margaret sat frozen at her dining table as the video played. "She's been rewriting history, locking me out emotionally, financially, and now legally. She's trying to erase me." A long pause. Then the dagger. "I loved my father. But after he died, she changed. She became cruel, controlling. I worry for her mental state." Within hours, the clip was everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. Hashtags exploded. "Shock sons matter too." "Shock Margaret exposed." "Shock family fraud." Her email inbox overflowed. "You're sick. That man raised you and you reward him with this? Rot in hell, witch." Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled. One email included a photo of her house, zoomed in, taken recently. Another simply read, "Hope you sleep well tonight." She sat back slowly, the room tilting slightly. Sadie called the next morning. "He dropped the nuclear PR bomb. You need to stay off the internet." Margaret stared at the curtains, still drawn. "He posted our address, didn't he?" "Technically, someone else did. A follower. But yes, it's out there." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Is this what he wants? To push me into hiding?" He wants to win. You stepping back might look like guilt, but speaking up could inflame it." Margaret exhaled, slow and sharp. "Then what?" "Do nothing, for now. Let the noise tire itself out." But noise had a way of turning into knives. By midweek, her mailbox began filling with letters. Not the kind with postage, the kind scrawled in Sharpie and sealed with spite. One was just a single word: traitor. Another said, "Give your son what's his or karma will." And the house didn't feel like hers anymore. That evening, Margaret sat at the edge of her bed, holding a photo of Darren at 6 months old. Smiling, toothless, wrapped in the hospital's pale green blanket. She remembered the night he first came home. Charles had built the crib himself. They'd taken turns waking up for feedings. She could still hear Darren's soft baby breath against her collarbone. Smell the milk-soaked onesie. Feel his tiny fingers clinging to hers like she was the whole world. That little boy was gone now, had been for years. She set the photo down, stood up, and walked toward the den. The camera blinked on. She sat straight, composed. Behind her, a row of neatly stacked binders. In her lap, the itemized receipt, Charles's journal, their wedding certificate, the will, notarized and time-stamped. "Hello," she began, voice level. "My name is Margaret Whitlow, and I want to tell you what Darren didn't." She moved through the timeline calmly. Her voice didn't crack when she spoke of the debts, the betrayals, or the $75,000 Charles had sacrificed to keep Darren out of prison. "This isn't about inheritance, it's about accountability, and I kept every record because I knew one day I might need them." She stared into the lens. Today is that day. The upload hovered at 98% when her phone buzzed. A new notification. Darren Truth. Part 2. When a parent turns predator. She clicked. Darren stared into the camera again, this time holding a tissue. I wish I didn't have to say this, but she was emotionally abusive, even physically sometimes. I kept quiet for years, but now she's lying to the world about me, and I have to speak up. He reached down and held up a worn-out journal, one Margaret recognized instantly, the one she had gifted him as a teen, hoping he'd write out his feelings instead of lashing them onto others. She told me once that I was a mistake. Margaret's breath caught. I forgive her, but the world deserves to know who she really is. Margaret's phone vibrated again, this time from an unknown number. A voicemail transcription appeared. "Hi, this is Rachel Holloway from the Tribune. We'd like your side of the story before this escalates further." Margaret hovered over the publish button like it was a detonator. The room was silent except for the soft hum of her desktop fan. Her hands, steady despite everything, clicked once. Upload complete. The truth, recorded in her own voice, her own words, was now out in the world. 36 minutes and 59 seconds. No makeup, no filters, just facts. She walked to the kitchen and turned on the kettle. In the next room, her email exploded. By the time she returned with tea in hand, the video had reached 4,000 views. 10 minutes later, 14,000. She braced herself for the worst. But then, something shifted. Wait, so she paid his rent for 3 years straight? She shows every canceled check, every Venmo, every receipt. My mom cut me off at 21 and I didn't sue her. This guy screams narcissist. Margaret scrolled, stunned. Twitter threads dissected Darren's videos like crime scene evidence. Reddit ran timelines. YouTube commentators who'd once dogpiled now backpedaled. The tide was turning, and fast. An email with the subject line, "From someone who's seen behind his mask." Margaret opened it. "Hi. I dated Darren for 2 years. I watched him manipulate his way out of every consequence. He lied to you, to Charles, to everyone. I have emails and voice messages. I'm willing to testify, anonymously if possible. I just couldn't sit back anymore." She stared at the screen, heart racing. A former girlfriend. Willing to help. Margaret exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. She replied quickly, professionally. "Thank you. I'm passing this to my attorney." She copied Sadie in. The next morning, Sadie called. "This woman, Sophie, is gold. We verified the recordings. He told her, quote, 'I'll milk my mom dry before I go broke.'" Margaret closed her eyes. "And he meant it." Sadie paused. "Also, the Tribune called me directly. They want to do a feature. They're sympathetic." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Let's do it. If this is going to be a war, I'm done hiding behind the curtains." 2 days later, a small crew arrived at her home. Producer, camera operator, sound tech. Margaret wore her Sunday best, a navy sweater, wedding ring still on, her late husband's watch buckled around her wrist. The camera's red light clicked on. She spoke softly, never theatrically. Her words were sharp, not loud. Her voice didn't crack. It anchored. "I raised him alone for the first 6 years. Charles adopted him when he married me. We gave him love, education, support. What we didn't give him," she paused, "was a mirror." Photos of Darren and Charles were shown on screen, report cards, old holiday cards, proof of all the ways Margaret tried to keep her son from unraveling. People say family is forever, but what happens when family uses that as a weapon? Her eyes didn't waver. This isn't revenge, it's reality. During a lighting reset, Margaret sat quietly, sipping water. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown caller. No voicemail. Then a message. "This is Henry Wallace, Darren's former stepfather. I saw your video. There's something I think you should have seen a long time ago. It involves a loan he took out, in your name, when he was 23. He used my address. He thought I'd never notice. I can show you the paperwork, but I'd rather speak in person." Her breath caught. She hadn't spoken to Henry in over a decade. He and her ex had broken up before Darren was even out of high school. But she remembered Henry. Kind, patient, quiet. He never wanted children of his own, but treated Darren gently. That man had vanished from their lives quietly, until now. She called Sadie immediately. "He says he has evidence?" "Get a location. We'll set up a meeting. Bring a recorder. If he's offering what I think he is, we may have just found our game ender." Margaret stared out the window. The sun had started to set, bleeding orange across the treetops. Somewhere, she thought, her son was watching her name get dragged through fire, and he still thought he'd walk away clean. The coffee shop was small, tucked into the corner of an old brick plaza with faded lettering and wobbly ceiling fans. Margaret arrived early, her scarf pulled tight despite the late spring warmth. She chose a seat facing the entrance. She didn't like surprises anymore. At 2:07 p.m., Henry Wallace walked in, older than she remembered but not by much, same steady posture, same clean-shaven jaw and brown loafers that said, "I came in peace." He carried a folder like it weighed more than it should. "I didn't know if you'd actually show," he said gently, sitting across from her. "I almost didn't," Margaret admitted, "but I've learned lately, the past doesn't stay buried." Henry opened the folder, sliding over a single sheet. A loan application dated 2009, her name typed in all caps, social security number, a shaky, curling signature. "That's not mine," she whispered, tracing her finger over the ink. "I know. I found it when I was cleaning out the garage last month. It was buried under a box of Darren's high school yearbooks. He must have stashed it while visiting." Henry exhaled. "He used my old address. I had no idea at the time." Margaret's stomach coiled. "How much?" $35,000. He defaulted. Collections chased the address, then vanished. Henry pushed over 2 more forms. There were 4 others like it, all in your name. She sat back, hand to her mouth, eyes glazed. Her chest didn't ache from heartbreak anymore, just rage. Hardened and heavy, like lead. That night, she called Sadie. "It's real, all of it," Margaret said, her voice tight. "He's been stealing from me for over a decade. I thought this started with the will. I was wrong. I was always the mark." Sadie didn't miss a beat. "We're adding identity theft and financial fraud to the countersuit. This changes everything." Margaret stared at her kitchen wall, lined with faded family photos. Darren's 8th grade portrait stared back, tie crooked, smile crooked. "I want him prosecuted," she whispered. "Not just discredited, exposed." "You will?" Sadie replied. "But I need you to brace for something else." Sadie arrived the next morning with a yellow envelope. "These came in from the DNA lab. You signed the release last month, remember?" Margaret blinked. "Right. I didn't think they'd bother running it." Sadie placed the papers gently on the table. "You might want to sit." She did. Sadie opened the first page and read aloud. "Paternity test results indicate a 0.00% probability of genetic relation between Charles Evans and Darren Miles Evans." The words didn't land right at first. They floated in the air like fog. What?" Sadie looked at her. "Charles wasn't his biological father." Margaret's chest rose and fell. The clock ticked louder than it should have. Then, almost involuntarily, she laughed, once hollowly. "That fool," she said softly. "He always knew. That's why he couldn't look at Darren the same those last few years." She rubbed her temples. "I told him once, early on, Darren was from before we met. I thought I was doing the right thing by letting Charles raise him as his own. And Charles never told him otherwise," Sadie said gently. "No," Margaret muttered, "but maybe Darren always sensed it. Maybe that's why he hated Charles. Why he only ever saw him as a wallet. The betrayal had metastasized. This wasn't just financial, it was generational. Legacy-level damage. "Can we use this?" Margaret asked. "In court? No," Sadie said. "Not unless Darren brings it up. But emotionally, for you, it might help explain the things that never made sense." Margaret nodded slowly. Her son had always kept 1 foot outside the door. Now she understood why. The phone buzzed on the counter. A court notification. Sadie leaned in and read it aloud. "Your son has escalated to a wrongful disinheritance claim. He's trying to argue that Charles was mentally manipulated and you poisoned him against his only child." Margaret snorted. "His timing's perfect. He's cornered, and now he's clawing at the walls." She stood, taller than she had in days. "Let him try," she said. The next day, Darren entered the deposition room in a crisp navy blazer, his hair neatly combed, his expression a curated mix of wounded son and wronged heir. He clutched a folder too tightly, knuckles pale, like someone rehearsing sincerity in front of a mirror. Margaret sat at the other end of the long oak conference table, silent, her eyes steady but unreadable. Next to her, Sadie tapped a pen rhythmically against her notepad, sensing a performance was about to begin. The court reporter gave the go-ahead and the deposition commenced. Darren leaned toward the microphone with a practiced breath. "I loved my father. He was my role model. Losing him has been devastating." His voice broke at the word devastating, a crack perfectly timed. "And now I'm just trying to understand why I've been cut out. It doesn't make sense. I visited him. I called. I helped." Sadie didn't interrupt. She let him pile it on. "I'm not perfect," Darren continued, placing a trembling hand over his chest, "but I did my best to be there for my family. My mother's treatment of me now, filing lawsuits, airing private matters, it's all very out of character. I fear she's not well." Margaret blinked slowly, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Sadie finally leaned in. "Mr. Evans, can you explain this audio recording?" She pressed play on a small recorder. Darren's voice filled the room, rage-filled, unmistakable. "You think you can just erase me? You and Dad? Try it, and I swear I'll burn this family down." Darren stiffened. "That's out of context." Sadie clicked the pen once. "There's more." Another clip played. "If you don't wire the money by Friday, don't bother calling again. I'll make you regret it." Darren swallowed, glancing at his attorney, who was now staring into the table. Margaret didn't look at him. She simply whispered to Sadie, "Play the voicemail from last November." Another audio file, this one quieter. Charles's frail voice. "I'm afraid of him, Maggie. I didn't want to see it, but he's not safe." Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. Darren rubbed his forehead, his hand trembled. The judge overseeing the proceeding, seated beside the stenographer, cleared his throat. "Given the material presented and inconsistencies in Mr. Evans's testimony, I'm ordering a full forensic audit of the estate's financial history, including all transactions made by the deceased in the last 2 years of his life." The room shifted. Darren's attorney sat back, his expression draining. Darren blinked rapidly as if trying to process the weight of that sentence. Margaret remained still, but inside her ribs vibrated with a quiet ache. This wasn't a victory. Not yet, not really. Back at home that evening, Margaret sat alone in the study, journal open in her lap. The fire crackled softly. Her handwriting was steady, looping across the page as she reread the entries she had started when Darren was still a boy. June 3rd, 1998. "Darren lied today. Said he was sick to get out of school. Charles let it slide. I didn't. I told him trust is like a teacup. Drop it once, and it's never the same again." October 12th, 2004. Found $200 missing from my purse. Darren denied it. He swore on everything, but I saw the cash tucked in his jacket pocket later. I didn't confront him. I should have. Her throat tightened. It wasn't just grief. It was the hollowing realization that the boy she had loved might never have existed the way she remembered. Had she raised a stranger? Or worse, had she raised someone who learned to weaponize affection? Sadie's text buzzed on her phone. One line lit up the screen. "You'll want to see this audit report. It's bad." Margaret opened the attachment. Her hands went still halfway through the second page. Over $200,000. Gone from Charles's accounts during the last 15 months of his life, withdrawn through a series of small shell transactions linked to a now-defunct caregiving company. One Darren had quietly registered under a different name. She dropped the phone onto the desk. Her heart didn't race. It slowed, settling into something colder. Sadie's office smelled of burnt coffee and focus. A corkboard wall was littered with receipts, screen grabs, and red string crisscrossing between pinned transaction logs. Margaret stood near the window, staring out at the street, while Sadie traced her finger down a spreadsheet that didn't blink or lie. "Every dollar has a trail," Sadie muttered. "Even if it limps." Margaret turned. Did he really steal from his dying father? Sadie didn't answer. She didn't have to. The evidence blinked back from her monitor. Microtransactions funneled into a caregiving LLC called Shelter Care Services, LLC, registered 2 years ago under a P.O. box in Dayton. The listed director? A man named Jacob D. Ellis. Only there was no Jacob, not in any real capacity, but there were social posts with Darren tagged at the address used to register the business, and surveillance footage, grainy but clear, of Darren withdrawing cash using the LLC's business debit card. Same hoodie, same gait, same man. Sadie tapped the side of the screen. He invented a ghost to rob his father blind. While Charles was too weak to dial the phone, Darren was siphoning him dry. Margaret sat down slowly, her bones aching beneath the weight of truth. He created a company that never existed, to care for a man he couldn't even look in the eye during hospice. Sadie nodded, jaw tight. And billed Charles's account in increments small enough to avoid alerting the bank. That's not just immoral, that's criminal. Margaret's voice was hollow now. I thought I was raising a boy. I raised a scam artist. The next morning, Margaret stood before the court once more, hair pinned, navy dress crisp, grief sharpened into steel. She handed the DA's office a sealed folder. Inside were the transaction logs, false tax filings, and business registration showing the fictitious LLC. Alongside it, hospice reports showing the actual caregiver never matched Shelter Care's claims. Whispers echoed across the courtroom like wind through broken glass. The judge's brow furrowed. "Counsel, is this verified?" Sadie stood, her voice unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. We cross-checked every transaction with bank logs, tax filings, and state records. The company used to withdraw funds did not exist in any physical capacity, nor was Darren Evans licensed as a caregiver." The DA requested time to review. The gallery stirred. Darren sat hunched beside his attorney, face flushed, teeth clamped behind a sour smile that was slowly cracking under pressure. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She just turned to the DA's assistant and said, "This wasn't for revenge. I don't want his money. I want his mask removed." Outside the courtroom later, Darren's defense attorney approached Sadie with a sheepish expression and an envelope in hand. "A quiet settlement," he said. 6 figures. NDA. She walks away with dignity. He walks away quieter. Sadie didn't even look at the envelope. That's not what she came for. Margaret stepped forward, her voice low, composed and dangerous in its clarity. "He used my name to bleed the man I loved dry, lied to my face while Charles coughed himself to sleep. He made a joke out of love, and now he wants mercy?" The lawyer tried again. "This protects everyone." "No," Margaret said, stepping closer. "You don't. Get to rewrite this in silence. The court deserves to see who he really is." The lawyer opened his mouth, but Margaret had already turned, heels clicking down the hallway like a verdict. That night, Margaret sat in her kitchen, an untouched cup of tea cooling beside her as news alerts lit up her phone. DA confirms ongoing criminal review into Darren Evans, former caregiver accused of elder financial exploitation, estate trial, Sparks, criminal probe. She closed her phone and stared at the darkened window. Her reflection looked older, yes, but less broken. She was no longer chasing justice for a man who had passed. She was standing in it, breathing in it, reclaiming the version of herself that motherhood had made quiet for too long. Margaret refuses the settlement and says, "Let the court see who he really is." The courtroom buzzed like a held breath. Press badges flashed from every corner, laptops clacked behind the gallery railing, and beneath the weight of 100 eyes, Darren Evans adjusted his tie like a man drowning in his own suit. Margaret sat still, her spine a straight line of calm fury. She wasn't dressed for battle. She was dressed for closure, dark navy, minimal jewelry, no makeup except for the quiet defiance in her eyes. "People of Ohio versus Darren Elias Evans," the bailiff announced. The air thickened. Behind her, Sadie leaned in. "You ready?" Margaret didn't turn. "I was born ready, I just didn't know it until now." The prosecution began with their witnesses. First, Elisa Vaughn, Darren's ex-girlfriend. Her voice trembled at first, then hardened like steel poured into a mold. "He used my credit, lied to my parents. He told me once that love was leverage, and if someone gave you any, you'd be a fool not to use it." Second, Henry Walker, Darren's former stepfather. "He used to laugh after manipulating people, like it was a sport, like kindness was weakness." When the defense tried to rattle him, he responded flatly, "I lived with him. You're not rattling me half as much as he did." Then, Nurse Elena Carranza, who cared for Charles in his final 3 months. Her testimony was unshakable. Darren showed up twice. One visit lasted 15 minutes. The second, he asked for the house deed while his father was on morphine. Each word chipped away at the persona Darren had tried so hard to present: dutiful son, misunderstood victim. And each time his name was spoken, he flinched, as though the courtroom lights had suddenly grown brighter just above his seat. By the time Sadie stood for the closing argument, there was no need for theatrics. She simply held up a black binder and said, "This is not a vendetta. This is a record of betrayal, one line at a time. Documents, videos, witnesses. He forged trust, not just signatures." Then she stepped aside, and Margaret rose. A quiet ripple passed through the room. Her hands trembled, not from nerves, but from decades of being told to be silent, composed, agreeable. She walked to the stand, looked at the jury, looked at Darren, then began. "You all see me as an older woman, maybe a grieving widow. I am both, but I'm also a mother, and the word mother has been weaponized against me. It was used to shame me for standing up, to guilt me into giving more, to silence me when my instinct screamed something was wrong. Well, now you know, I wasn't crazy, I wasn't cruel, I was right." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. She reached into her purse, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and unfolded it. "This is the receipt I gave him the day of his father's will reading, not to collect, but to remind him that before he lied and forged and drained accounts, he was carried, federal, fought for, loved." She turned to the judge. "And now I let him go, legally, emotionally, entirely." When she returned to her seat, the courtroom was silent, not out of respect, but from awe. Darren's face had gone slack, not from guilt, but from the realization that no one in that room believed him anymore, not even the jury. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't need to. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't always arrive with applause or bang a gavel. Sometimes it was the way a liar shrunk into his chair, the way his attorney no longer made eye contact, the way a mother finally exhaled after holding her breath for 28 years. Outside, reporters were already filing headlines. One cameraman whispered, "She's the story now." Sadie brushed a piece of lint from her sleeve. "You didn't just win, Margaret. You rewrote your narrative." Margaret didn't answer, because the bailiff returned, holding a folded note from the jury foreperson. "We've reached a verdict." The courtroom stands still as the jury foreperson prepares to read it aloud. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Margaret Ann Evans." Gasps scattered across the courtroom. Darren didn't flinch. He blinked slowly, as if reality had forgotten to knock before entering. But Margaret sat motionless, her eyes forward, a single tear balanced at the corner, unshed. Not sadness, release. The judge cleared her throat and continued. "In addition to civil damages, this court refers the matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation into elder financial exploitation, forgery, and identity theft." Darren's attorney whispered furiously into his ear, but Darren didn't respond. He was frozen. Not in regret, he'd missed that train a long time ago, but in shock that his story, his image, had unraveled before cameras and strangers alike. Margaret turned her head slowly and met his eyes one last time. No fury, no pity, just clarity. Then she stood. Outside the courthouse, microphones swarmed like bees. "Margaret, any comment on the verdict? Do you feel vindicated? Is this justice or revenge?" She said only one sentence. "Accountability is not revenge. It's the receipt you get after the damage is done." By the next morning, Darren's name was trending nationwide, not as a misunderstood son, but as a disgraced scammer. A profile piece in the Cleveland Ledger called him a charming predator in khakis. The bank froze his accounts. Creditors circled like vultures. His video channels were demonetized. One by one, the bridges he torched long ago finished collapsing behind him. Margaret didn't celebrate. She drove in silence, alone, to the cemetery with a folded letter and a small bouquet of forget-me-nots. The late September wind curled around her ankles, teasing the edge of her coat as she knelt before Charles's headstone. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she whispered, voice dry from the weight of restraint. "You tried to protect me. I see it now. I just couldn't believe he'd become this." She unfolded the letter and placed it gently against the base of the stone, weighed down by a river rock they once collected on a hike. "I kept the promises, all of them, even the ones that broke me." She lingered, not to mourn, but to thank, not to say goodbye, but to close a chapter. Later that evening, back at home, Sadie stood at Margaret's doorstep, holding a brown paper bag and 2 mismatched bottles of wine. "Courtroom was brutal," Sadie said. "You hungry?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Starving." They sat in the dining room that once echoed with Charles's laughter and Darren's accusations. Now it was quiet, peacefully so. Sadie pulled out takeout containers, Thai curry, shrimp rolls, jasmine rice. "Do you regret any of it?" Sadie asked gently. Margaret sipped her wine. "I regret waiting. I don't regret ending it." The room grew warm, filled with the soft clink of silverware and a kind of sisterhood forged not by blood, but by battle. After dinner, Sadie offered to help clean up, but Margaret waved her off. "Go. You've done enough. More than enough." Sadie hesitated. "You're not alone, Margaret. Not anymore. And don't let him convince you otherwise." Then she left. Margaret stood in the quiet again, staring at the closed front door. She exhaled, long and slow. Then she walked to her study, the one room Darren had always avoided. She poured a cup of chamomile tea, turned off her phone notifications, and opened the window a crack. The cool night breeze smelled of autumn leaves and distant rain. Then her laptop pinged. New message. From Darren. Subject: "Please, just one meeting. No manipulation, no threats, just a single line beneath the header. You don't have to forgive me. Just give me 10 minutes." Margaret stared at the screen, fingers frozen above the keyboard. The tea in her hand had gone cold. The cafe was nearly empty. Late morning sun slanted through the windows, dust flecks dancing in quiet suspension. Margaret chose the corner booth, her back to the wall, eyes facing the door. She hadn't seen Darren in nearly a year, not since the verdict, not since the world discovered the man behind the mask. The bell over the door jingled. He entered slowly, wearing the same leather jacket from his high school graduation, a jacket that once swamped his shoulders but now barely fit. He looked thinner, but not in the redemptive way, like the world had eaten at him, like guilt had only brushed the surface but never quite seeped in. He didn't smile. "Smart." "Hi, Mom," he said, approaching cautiously, palms visible like a suspect trying to prove he wasn't armed with anything but regret. Margaret didn't stand. She folded her hands over her lap and nodded once. "You have 10 minutes." Darren sat across from her, his eyes searching, begging. "I've been in therapy. Real therapy. Not the crap I used to fake. I know what I did, how I hurt you. I was broken. I let greed drown out everything." Margaret studied him silently, her eyes steady. A warmth in them maybe, but distant, like sunlight seen from behind frosted glass. "I want to fix it," he continued. "Not just legally, I mean, us. I miss you." "You miss what I gave," she said softly. "Not who I am." He leaned in, desperation edging his voice. "Just, look, I brought something. I wrote you a letter. No legal tricks, I swear." He fumbled with his backpack, pulling out a manila envelope, sliding it across the table. Margaret didn't touch it. Instead, she reached into her own leather satchel, the one Charles had bought her for their 30th anniversary, and pulled out a framed sheet of paper. Darren's breath hitched as he recognized it. The receipt, now matted behind museum glass, its numbers bold against soft parchment, a ledger of a mother's devotion, hospital bills, braces, midnight rides to rehearsals, broken bones, broken promises, every sacrifice listed, priced, signed. Margaret set it gently on the table between them. This, she said, was never about money. It was never about punishment either. It was about acknowledgement that the person you hurt existed. Darren blinked quickly, his jaw tightening. So this is it then? She nodded once. This is it. He didn't argue. That was the final proof. Not that he understood, but that he finally accepted he never had control in the first place. Margaret stood. He didn't follow. She left the cafe with the sun on her shoulders and silence in her bones. Not emptiness, just peace. The kind that grows in soil scorched clean. Months passed. In a cottage nestled beyond the edge of a lakeside town, Margaret opened her windows to the early spring breeze. The trees were blooming again. Dogwoods, tulips, that one wild vine Charles could never tame. She dipped her brush into a jar of warm ochre, dragging color across the canvas. Sunrise over still water, calm, earned. A knock at the door. Her neighbor, Beth, a retired nurse with laugh lines deeper than any wrinkle cream could erase, held up a plate of blueberry scones. "Hot from the oven! You painting again, you little rebel?" Margaret chuckled and opened the door wider. "Come in before I eat them all myself." They settled into the sunroom, mugs of chamomile steaming between them, the scent of butter and fresh linen wrapping the room like a blanket. Outside, children played with kites along the shore. Margaret watched them a moment, laughing, tumbling, weightless. Beth looked at her curiously. "You ever miss the noise? The old life?" Margaret paused. Then she smiled. Not the brittle kind she'd worn for years, a full, living one. "No," she said, "I don't miss anything that cost me myself." She excused herself for a moment, returning with a framed piece of paper set quietly above her mantel. The receipt, the same numbers, the same ink. But now beside it hung something else. A blank canvas, titled only in charcoal pencil, "Freedom." As evening fell, she stepped onto her porch with a cup of mint tea. The breeze carried a quiet hum from the nearby lake. Somewhere far away, the past sat down and finally stayed still. Margaret switched on her porch light. Not for safety, just because she liked how it made the house feel like someone had always been home. She took out her recorder, her voice soft but firm. Sometimes the only way to be heard is in court. She stopped, rewound, then added one final note. "I raised a son, and when he chose greed over grace, I raised myself instead."